So let's create a variable outside the while loop and call it number of lines. Int, it's going to be an integer because it's going to be just a number of lines, 1, 2, 5, okay. And so int number of lines, let's first set it to 0 because when we are counting something initially it's 0. And so anytime it finds a line, what we want to do is we want to increase number of lines by 1, right? So let's say number of lines is going to be equal to what's already stored in number of lines plus 1. So we are adding 1 to what's already stored number of lines. So number of lines for the first time, right? If it finds a line for the first time, number of lines is going to be 0. 0 plus 1 is 1, and then we are adding, or basically we are setting number of lines to the result of this calculation, which is going to be 1. So number of lines is going to be 1. When it finds another line, okay, when it has another line, it has a next line, number of lines will be 1. So 1 plus 1 will be 2, and then we'll store 2 into number of lines, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, we have to basically read the line in order for it to, okay, has next doesn't read a line. Has next just checks to see if it has a line. Okay, it tries to see if it has a line, but it doesn't read a line. There's something called a read position of every file. So if you call something like the next line or next int or something, it reads. In this case, we're going to call next int. When we call next int, it reads the line and moves the read position from the end of this line to the beginning of this line, and waits for us to call, like a method that actually reads a line. But if we only add 1 to number of lines, when we call has next again, has next is still just checking the first number. It's always going to check the first number. It doesn't move on to the second line to check to see if there's a line. It doesn't do that. What actually moves line by line is when we call a method that actually reads a line, because when it's done reading a line, it moves to the next line and waits for us. So has next doesn't do that. Has next doesn't read a line and move on to the next line to wait for us. But a method that actually reads a line, like next int or next line, actually reads a line, moves the read position to the next line, and waits for us to call it again to read the line and move again. And so let's read a line. But the thing is, if we read a line, if it has a line, in this case, it's going to have a first line, for example. It's going to check. So this is going to return true because it has a line. We want to read it, but we don't need that number, right? We don't need that number. Normally, we would read a line by saying, for example, charge account file to read from dot next int. Next int because this number is actually an integer, so we are reading this integer. Now next int, normally we read this next int and then store it in a variable. Let's say in a variable, right? Normally we would do that, but we don't need it in a variable. We don't actually need this number for anything. All we are interested in is just the number of lines. And so we can just call charge account file to read from .next int. We can just call it. It's going to basically actually read this line, try to return it, but there's nothing over here to receive it. We don't care. We don't care about it. It's going to just read this line, try to return it, and then throw it away. We don't care about that number. But when we call next int, what we've done is we've actually read this line, and so it moves the read position to the next line here, to the beginning of the next line, and waits for us. And so when has next runs again, has next is not checking this first line anymore. It's checking now the second line. And then has next will keep on checking line by line until it gets to the end of the file. In that case, has next will return false. Right? If we don't call next int, then has next will always check the first line, and then it will be an infinite loop. Okay? So that's what we're doing with this. We don't need a number, we're just calling next int. Normally we'll store it in a variable, but we don't have to. You can try to store it in a variable, you can do that, but if you don't use it, then there's no need to. Okay? This is what we're interested in. So you read a line, keep track, add 1 to the number of lines. If it has another next line here, read it, but then throw it away. We don't really use it for anything, and then keep track of the number of lines. Add 1 to it. That's what we're doing here. Okay, so once we are done with this while loop, outside the while loop, what we want to do is basically return the number of lines. Right, a number of lines is an integer, and so we define this method to return an integer. A number of lines is an integer here. And so this whole method, once we call it, provide a file name, is going to return number of lines. When we are done, let's close the file. Let's see. Let's close the file that we are trying to read from. So it's going to be charge account file to read from. For some reason let's close charge account file to read from, and we do that by saying charge account file to read from dot close. So this method, once we call it, it's basically going to return the number of lines. Actually, return has to be the last statement in our method. Otherwise, that close file, that closed line, this line wouldn't be reached if it's after the return statement. So we close the file and then we return number of lines. Okay, so over here we needed to initialize the charge account array. We needed to give it a size, and now we will have the size when we call get number of lines and provided the file name. But we already have the file name because the user will provide the file name here. And so let's initialize this array, okay, with the number of lines in the file. To do that, we have a variable that's going to hold an integer array. And so now let's actually create an integer array and set a size. And so charge account numbers is going to be equal to now a new integer array, and then now we need to set the size. This is my semicolon here. We need to set the size. The size, we know we can call the get number of lines. Okay. Now we can call the get number of lines method. Now the get number of lines itself needs a file name, and the file name is the same file name, basically what the user is going to type here. Is provide here. We have it, so we can pass it into this method. And so this whole method, right, is going to return the number of lines, which happens to be in the 2 square brackets, and that's where we define our size. Okay, the size of the array, how many items or how many numbers are going to go in the array. So that's what we've done here. So basically by doing this, we've set the size of the charge account numbers. Now we know the exact number of items that are going to go into the charge account numbers array. So now all we have to do is, we have it initialized with a size. All we have to do is store the numbers in there. Okay, so it's basically going to be the same idea. We already have the file represented. We already have the file, we can read from, the source we can read from, which is the file itself. Now, let's basically do the same thing, right? We want to check if it has next. Same thing, but the content may be a bit different. So while charge account file, charge account file to read from, hold on 1 second. Yeah, which we have here, same thing. Let's delete the content. And so while it has a next, okay, while it has a line, we read from it, right? But this time around, when we read it, we need it. We are going to read and then store it in the array. But we need to know the exact slot to store it from. And we know that we can refer to those slots by indices, or the index. And so I'm going to create a variable outside the loop. And it's going to be an integer. It's going to be the index. And set the index initially to 0. And so I'm going to say that while the charge account file to read from has the next line, or has next, which is basically the same thing as has a next line, right? We want to read this line and store it in the charge account numbers array in the position 0, or basically index 0. So the way I do that is I say that charge account, name of the array, charge account numbers, the name of the array, charge account numbers, okay, in this particular slot, index 0, right? Initially, index is going to be 0. I want to store in the first element here in the file, and I do that by reading that line. And I use my scanner, or basically what I'm using to read from the file, and I call .next int because I'm reading the next integer here. Now once I call next int, I am reading the next integer here. The read position will move to the beginning of this line and wait for me to call the next int again. And so basically what I've done is I read this line and I store it in the index 0 of the charge account numbers array. But if I don't increase, I need my semicolon. If I don't increase index will always be 0, and basically I'll always be storing in something in index 0 of the charge account numbers array. I need to basically increase the index variable so that if it has another line, I'm not storing that next line. So that if it has another line, I'm not storing that next line in the same index 0. Okay, I'm storing it in the next slot. And so anytime I'm able to store one item in an array, I increase the index by 1. So index is going to be equal to index plus 1. Okay, I'm increasing the index by 1. So if index is 0, then it's going to be 0 plus 1, which is going to result to 1. 1 will be stored in index. If index is 1, it's going to be 1 plus 1, which is going to be 2, and 2 will be stored in index. Now this can also be written in a shortcut form, right? I can write it this way: index plus equals 1. I'm increasing index by 1, okay? Or index is being increased by 1, okay? And so now, if I'm able to store something in the first slot, which is 0, then I increase the index to 1. And if it's able to find another next line, if it has another next line, which is if it has this second line here, then read this, because next int, once you call next int, the read position moves to, well, the next int will read the first line, right? And the read position will move to the next line, wait for you. If you call next int again, it reads the second line. And so that's what we're doing here. Next int again, once it's able to store something in the very first slot, it reads the next line and stores it in index, in the next index, because index will be increased by 1. Initially it will be 0, which is the first slot. And so 1 will be the second slot. And if we're able to store something in the second slot, increase index by 1, so index becomes 2. And then if we're able to find another line, now we are storing that number in index 2. And then we increase index to 3. If we're able to find another line, we're storing that line in index 4, because that's why we're increasing index by 1, so we can always store the next element in the next slot. Okay, so by doing this process will basically store all the elements in basically all the lines in the file, and store it in the array. We're basically populating the array with all the numbers in the file. Once we're done, we want to go ahead and close the file. Okay, close the file that we are basically reading from, we're basically reading from. And so to do that, I use the name of the scanner. Okay, that's what I'm using to read from the file. So charge account file to read from .close. Okay, we haven't really run this program to see if we have any errors, but I think this should be fine. All right, so we have our get number of lines, which is basically getting the number of lines of the file. We provided a file name. In the constructor, the user will provide the file name, and so we can use that file name the user provided in that method when we call it here, right? And then we are basically reading from the file and storing each number in the file in the array. And so now we'll have the array. And so now we can work with the array. Basically now calling check number for presence, we'll basically have numbers in the array, right? And then use it. But the only thing is we're first reading from the file. Let's compile this and see what happens if we have any errors, and we do. I'm missing a semicolon here at the end of this line. Okay, we are over here, we are closing, okay, the scanner. Basically the scanner that's reading from the file, we are closing it. Okay, that's what we're doing. We're pretty much closing the file, right? We're closing the file itself. Okay, so I put my semicolon there. Let me compile this again. Now we have another error. What is it saying? Let's see. Okay, so over here we can see that it's saying that unreported exception java.io file not found exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. All right, so we haven't covered exceptions yet, and that's all the way later in the chapters. But what this program is saying is this: it's saying that this particular method has potential code inside, or code inside that has code inside that has the potential to throw a certain kind of exception. For example, if we are trying to represent this particular file, okay, the file that the user has provided the file name for, if we try to represent it, what if it searches for the file and it doesn't find it? Then it's going to throw an exception. It's going to throw an error. And so it's telling us that if it has the potential to throw an error, then we have to write code to run when that happens. Otherwise, the program is going to crash. And so because we haven't tackled writing our own exceptions yet, right, we can tell the program to handle it for us. Okay, all we have to do is just let it know that, okay, this program has the potential to, or this code has the potential to cause an error. Now, because we haven't learned exception yet, we are telling it to handle it for us for now until we learn how to handle exceptions. And the way we do that is you basically append to the end of the method header. You tell it that, okay, this particular method has code that has the potential to throw an exception. And this particular exception is called an IO exception. Okay, an IO exception. So at the end of the method header, you say this particular method has content or has code that has the potential to throw. When we say throws IO exception, okay, so we're saying that this method has the potential to throw an IO exception. We say throws IO exception at the end of the method header. Okay, so we're saying this particular block has code somewhere in it that has the potential to throw an IO exception. We're telling it, and so now it knows, and so it's going to handle it for us until we learn how to write our own code to handle exceptions. Okay, so let's compile that, and we have another error, and that's basically saying the same thing, right? But this time around, it's saying it for our constructor, and it's the same thing, because what if it tries to, the user provides the file name. What if it tries to find the file and it doesn't find it? And this also has the potential to throw an IO exception. And so we have to tell the program that, okay, the code inside of this constructor also has the potential to throw an IO exception. At the end of the method header, we can say throws IO exception. So now we've told the program that, okay, this particular constructor has code inside of it that has the potential to throw an IO exception. So we've told it. So it's aware now. It says, okay, I'll handle it for you until you learn how to write your own code to handle exceptions. That's what it's telling us, basically. Okay, so I'm going to compile this. Okay, so we have another error. Let's see. It says cannot find symbol constructor charge account modification. Okay, so now so if you realize it jumped out of the class, that means it looks like we're good with the class. This is back to our class. If I run the program, compile the program again, it jumps outside of that charge account modification and it goes to our program. So this is our class again. Realize that when I compile this, it's going to jump from here to here to our main program. So I'm going to compile it and see that it jumped to our main program. And over here, it comes to this line where we are trying to create a charge account modification object. Now our constructor has been modified. Our constructor now accepts in an argument, which is the file name. Okay, it has. You need to provide it. Provide the constructor a file name, and that's why it's complaining and saying that it cannot find this particular symbol. Right? It's saying that if you're trying to create an object, then you have to provide it an argument here, and the argument is basically the file name that we have to provide it. And the name of the file, we named it charge account. It has the extension .txt, and so don't forget that. It's charge accounts.txt. Okay, so don't forget that. And so I'm going to type in the file name exactly. Charge account dot, I think that name with S. Charge accounts with S .txt. Don't forget the extension. Okay, compile this, and we still have an error. Let's see. Okay, so we have something similar to it saying this. Okay, it's saying that, and so that's an interesting thing about IO exceptions, right? And so if you have a method, okay, and inside that method, if you have another method that has code that has the potential to throw an IO exception, you not only need to append to the end of the method header of that inner method throws IO exception, but because that method sits in another outer method, you also have to append to the end of the method header of the outer method, right? You also have to append to it, to the end of it, throws IO exception. So what I'm trying to say is this. And so this is when we are trying to create our constructor. Create an object, using our constructor. This is where we're trying to create an object. And basically, this is coming from our class. We have told the program that this particular method has the potential to throw an IO exception. We have told the program that this constructor has the potential to throw an IO exception. But because this particular code, which has the potential to throw an IO exception, even though we've told it, because it sits in, if you have code, okay, that has the potential to throw an IO exception, we know this is coming from the class, right? Even though we've told the program that if it sits in another outer method here, which is our main method in this case, okay, in the main method it has code that has the potential to throw an IO exception. Even though we have appended to the end of these individual methods throws IO exception, we also have to append to any method that this code is sitting in. Okay, we also have to append to the end of that header, that method header, throws IO exception. Throws IO exception. Okay, you have to do that. If you have a method that has so basically, if you have one method that has code that has the potential to throw an IO exception, that sits in another method, you not only need to, basically what you have to do is you have to append to the end of that inner method throws IO exception. You also have to append to the outer method, the method that the inner method is sitting in. The outer method, you have to append to the outer method, the method header of the outer. Basically, you have to append to the end of the method header of the outer method throws IO exception. I hope this is clear. Okay. So because this line has the potential to throw an IO exception, even though we have appended, basically to the individual methods throws IO exception, you also have to append to the end of this method header because it sits in another outer method. We have to also append to the end of that outer method throws IO exception. And now let's compile this. Okay, and so the next thing it's telling us is this. It cannot find symbol class IO exception. This IO exception is coming from some kind of file class, right? Over here, remember in our charge account modification.java, we imported the java.io, basically all the classes in the java.io package. This is coming from that list of classes, or basically coming from this kind of library, or it's basically these are lots of classes, okay, in the java.io package. This IO exception is coming from there, and so it doesn't know what it is. That's why it's saying it cannot find symbol class IO exception. This is a class. Hold on a second. Yeah. So this is something that's coming from one of these classes in the java.io package, and so we have to import it so it has access to it. So I'm going to copy the same line, import it here so it has access to it now. Compile this, and now we're fine.